It's now time for our main event with your host, Chris Tetrold Blaine. Welcome to Once Upon a Turnbuckle.
It's a welcome back to what is a really, really special episode of Once Upon a Turnbuckle. I know I've said that many times before, but this one, this is the finale for me. I'm actually giving myself sort of a good few weeks off over the summer to kind of recover. It's been a busy year, and I thought this was the most perfect way to end it. Really, I've got a really special guest with me, which you can probably see on my screen. Those who are watching the video side. But sort of just to give it a little bit of a taster, so a lot of people who listen to this podcast will have heard me mention a certain guy multiple times throughout the course of the series, who I grew up watching, who was one of my favorites. Now, Bam Bam Bigelow is a name known worldwide, and it's not just in the wrestling community either. My dad, when I mentioned I was doing this episode, even my dad remembers Bam Bam Bigelow, and the only memories he's got is me penned in his ear when I was about 9-10 years old. He's one of the superstars responsible for most of my own childhood memories, as well as millions of others. And he was a multi-time world champion, so pretty much wherever he went, known to millions around the world for his time in the WWF, WCW, ECW, Japan. And in mine, a lot more people's opinions, he is one of, if not the best big man in the sport even now. And I'm honored to have with me one of the people who probably knew him better than anyone else, his son Shane Bigelow. Thank you so much for coming along.
Thanks for having me. What a great intro. We don't even have to talk anymore. You set it off. I know him really well, grew up with him.
I did.
Appreciate it.
No worries. I when I knew that this was going to be possible, I think I had so many questions I could ask, because it's not often that you get to talk to someone who knows one of your heroes on a certain level, and I think I've got too many questions. I'm probably not going to get around to asking them all. So this episode's really just to kind of talk about your dad, his career, what he was like outside the ring, anything really that you can remember that comes up along the way. Firstly, to kick us off, tell us a little bit about yourself, sort of, what you do, what you're doing these days, and, sort of plug yourself a little bit.
I'm not doing too much these days. My name is Shane Bigelow. I am a special education teacher. I teach here in central New Jersey, out in Middlesex County. As we talked before, this is my first day of the summer, so I'm not doing too much right now. But when I'm not teaching, I coach football, wrestling, and track, so I stay busy year round. I stay active, man. My career keeps me busy, and when I'm not doing that, my brother and I are out on the golf course losing golf balls and running across old ladies' fairways and stuff. So, and we're fishing wherever we can. So the normal stuff. Like if my father was here, we'd be doing the exact same thing.
Awesome.
And I'm enjoying it.
Awesome. You like where we live then, because my house was built on an old golf course. So when we were digging up our garden, we found like 70 or 80 golf balls underneath our earth. So, you probably have had a field day over it. But,
me and my brother yesterday were at the golf course, and there were two giant tattooed guys, and these old ladies are looking at us, and we're like trying to scoop balls out of the water, and he's almost falling in. It's a shit show every time we go, but it's always hilarious.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, let's jump into it then. Obviously, you when you came along, obviously your dad was already a wrestler. I believe, was it sort of 1988?
Yeah. So I was born June 9th, 1988. And I believe I want to say early May 88. That's when he either won the Royal Rumble or the Survivor Series or something. He got his really big early push when Hulk Hogan was going with, when it was like him and One Man Gang, and like him and Andre the Giant, and when it was like Hogan and Giant and all those guys. So that was, you know, prime 88 to early 89. And then he ended up doing Japan stint for a little while.
Yeah.
And then he went back to the WWF in the early 90s.
So talk about, obviously, just to give a little bit of background, anyone out there who's listening, there won't be anyone listening to this, I don't think, that doesn't know who Bam Bam Bigelow is. But up to that point, so obviously before you came along, the early part of his career, I thought this was a really cool fact. He debuted in 1985. His debut match was at Studio 54 in a match that was promoted by Paul Heyman. I mean, that's a pretty good start, really.
And to be like Studio 54, like that's a really, really famous venue. Yeah. And you would think like that they're like shutting down like Disco Fever to have like a bunkhouse brawl, but they pretty much did. Like they shut down Studio 54 for Paul Heyman to promote. He probably wasn't even Bam Bam Bigelow then. He was probably Crusher Yurkov then. Okay. And like, you know, that's so cool because I live 30, 40 miles away from New York City. And like, that's such a poignant 70s, 80s staple. And for his career to get kicked off in the Studio 54, cool. Like, oh, I can only imagine that show.
That's pretty cool. I didn't realize as well, because obviously we'll get into it and when he gets into ECW later on, but I didn't realize he had that sort of link with, was Paul Heyman someone who was always sort of there around his career, or was when he got to ECW later on, was that him kind of going back to Paul's company after all that time?
I think it's what you said, like going back to, this was a guy when early on in the career, we both started young in the business trying to figure it out. And, you know, they knew what to expect from one another, and they had gone and become wildly successful in their own fields. And then, you know, by the time ECW came about and it came to fruition when my father joined, it was, I mean, it's history after that.
Absolutely. Yeah. He was pretty much part of history everywhere he went. I don't think there's many stars that were so decorated, even though he didn't win any belts in the WWF. I mean, again, we'll get into my own memories as we go along as well, but he's one of the guys synonymous with that era that I absolutely love of wrestling sort of throughout the 90s. And he seemed to have, you know, some level of success everywhere he went, you know, whether it's Japan or, you know, what he did in the WWF and that. But what are your earliest memories of being around the wrestling industry through him?
So like my very earliest memories are like picking him up at Newark and at JFK at like 3:00 in the morning, like driving up, and we had this white Ford Bronco, like OJ Simpson at the time, and we would drive it up and I'd be in the back, like not in a seat, just bouncing around at like 3:00 in the morning. My mom would drive him up. We'd pull up to a terminal, and that would be like 2-3 times a week for maybe 5-6 years, because he'd be in Japan for 3 days. They would fly him out, come to Japan, do 2 shows, fly back. He'd do 2 weeks in Malaysia, come back. So those were my earliest memories. And then like when I was old enough to, you know, 92 to 95, we were going to everything east of the Mississippi that you drove to, WWF, we went to. So like weekends, like if they were doing TV tapings on a weekend, or if they were doing a pay-per-view on weekends, you know, like we were at it. If it was, because it was mainly in Connecticut, it was mostly in New York, you know, it was up and down the East Coast. We were down in Florida all the time. We went out to Vegas. I mean, we did it as much as possible to where we couldn't miss school, and he could take us along, he would, because they used to drive everywhere, every single place. Like it, we have a small airport by me. I remember that, you know, there'd be shows where either Vince or whatever promoter would hire a car to come pick us up at the house, take him around the corner to the place in the airport, and fly him on a little private jet just to go do this show. Like last minute, someone gets hurt, like just the stuff like that. And then him coming home from Japan with these like figurines, you know, because they have just like the whole Godzilla culture, and like it was so cool to have that. Like I'm covered in Japanese tattoos because that's just like something when I was a child. Like he would come home with these magazines, and it would just be like pictures of him and Vader and like all this stuff, and like you couldn't read any of it, so you would, like, as a kid, you would fill in the storylines in between, and it was so cool. And like now that I'm older, I start to see like the matches of him when he's in Japan, and what I think is really funny is what you can see how loose they are in Japan. They like, you can hear them talking, you know, and you got the Japanese commentators are speaking their language, and everybody there understands Japanese, but they know that we're the only ones that speak English. So in the middle of the thing, they'll hit him and they'll be like, "Fuck you!" Like, and they're just cursing everybody out and the whole thing, and like, you know, they're dying and laughing and having such a good time, but it's like so free that they can just do whatever they want. And like, it's cool, like, to like sit back and watch that and like see him, you know, 28, 29 years old. Like, I'm 33 years old in Japan with like Vader, and just having the time of their life. It's just something so cool to be able to like, you know, go back and YouTube and watch that stuff. It's ridiculous.
There are so many stars. A few of the guys that I've spoken to who wrestled out in Japan as well, they've all said that Japan was an experience all of its own. And quite a few of them, it was their favorite place to go because it was so different and a lot more kind of, let's say, serious, but you know, the Japanese wrestling style is a lot more, it's genuine, really. To, you know, they hit hard at that. Yeah,
they have like a genuine care for it, to where like we're very Americanized, and we love and hate it, and like the Japanese are very formal, and they even though that you're a heel or you're a face, they're very like, they love the show because they paid for the show. Like, here, I want to go see Bam Bam Bigelow, and I want to go see him beat, you know, the dog shit out of somebody. Like, they have just very different motivations. So like out there, those people, like, you're not going to get heckled like here.
No.
Which that's what makes it awesome here. But at the same time, like, I could see why that's like a Mount Rushmore or an Olympia, like that you have to make it to there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds so cool.
I've heard a little bit about him and Vader at some point, whether it's true or not, they didn't really get on, or they had a bit of a love-hate thing going on. Do you remember anything about Vader from back then? Did you get to be around them at all when they were together?
Their careers only coincided in Japan. Like, it would be very rare that they ever cross paths in the States. But I think that's more of just the illusion of people getting interviewed over the years and just being like that they didn't get along, because my grandmother, like a month ago, gave me a stack of pictures from the time my mother and father went to Japan. And Vader was right there. You know, like the famous picture of Vader with the black eye? And he's like that. My mother, they were at the Mike Tyson fight in Japan. My mother has a picture of him with like cake or some type of food in his mouth, like this. Like, so if they weren't cool, I don't know, man. Like,
that's pretty. Yeah.
He's got pictures of him, like, they're something that's so deeply personal that where, like, when you think of Vader, you think of that picture of him with that giant shiner, and it's like, my mother and father was sitting 2 rows away from him. Like, they both went to that. And you know, there might be locker room beefs, but you're both apex guys in your game. You know, Peter is a highly educated NFL athlete. My father is a freak athlete from the streets of Neptune, New Jersey. So like, you got 2 alphas and they pretty much build them as the exact same person, because if you have Vader and you have Bam Bam Bigelow, the only time they ever come together is in Japan. But their careers, like, Bam Bam leaves WWF, Vader goes in. My father goes to WCW. Like, it was like they filled the void for one another. So, you know, I can only see good things, but I could see where people see 2 alphas just like button heads. Because why would you concede? You're both at the top of your game. But I'm telling you, they understood when they got together, they made some serious great matches. Like, because you won't see that anywhere else in a super heavyweight match. Like 700 pounds of guys that could fly like that.
Yeah. I was quite late on, actually, when I realized it was I don't know what it was. It's some independent magazine that we got over in the UK, and they had this quite famous sort of set of pictures of them together with, you know, posing with the IWGP tag team titles in their hands now. I never knew they were a team at any point, let alone the champions. And I sort of looked at them and I thought, that's back then I couldn't see any of the footage from over there. So it's almost like it was just having to imagine what it was like to see them together and the brutality would imagine that they unleashed.
Like this whole, like that whole country, that whole like continent, Asia, like they got, you know, the way people around here think of like the greatest tag teams of the United States and United Kingdom, like they're the number ones in Japan. There is no question. Like the Steiners went over there and they were phenomenal.
Yeah.
I always watch them as a tag team duo, but like you're not going to get Crusher, Bam Bam Bigelow, and Big Van Vader a better tag team duo than that.
No. And they're both
Typhoon times 10.
Yeah, well, that's it. When you look at the bigger teams that you had over in America, yeah, natural disasters, I suppose, they're very grounded. They're a bit slower. They do a lot on the mat. And then you look at, I mean, Bam Bam really set the bar for what you can do as a 400-pounder. And I suppose Vader was in there as well. He didn't do, I don't think he was as good and could do what your dad did, but they were both on that level. You know, so.
I mean, it had to be just like one-upsmanship.
Yeah.
You know, like I read an article where it was like, who had the better suplex? It's like one of them went out one night, hit that thing, and the other one next drinking beers goes, I'm gonna hit that thing higher the next night. You know, like, and that's what it just must have been, is like two guys just trying to one up the next guy and just elevating each other's career, because they would come home with, like, it was so beneficial to go to Japan. They would come home with just stacks of cash. I loved it. I loved it so much. Much.
I've heard it pays well. I mean, you really had to earn it out there by the sounds of it, but, you know, it's worth going out there. So, yeah. So just going back to one thing you said in there, actually, just quickly about where they went. They kind of just like ships passing in the night almost. When your dad left the WWF and then Vader came in at the Royal Rumble, they actually advertised, I remember, Bam Bam for the Royal Rumble match in '96. They were advertising him, and obviously he left in between. And I just kind of wonder what it would have been like to have them both in that match. Would they have had that moment that Yokozuna and Vader had there? But for them to have that would have been pretty epic.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't see how it could have worked. You know, like one guy would have got brushed aside and one guy would have got pushed. And like the way their careers, the ships passing in the night and like meeting in Japan, like that was perfection.
Yeah.
They did. They were both very smart businessmen. Like they knew, you know, like if they ended up in the same company, we both have a very similar sell. You know, you can't have two of that. That's why Andre the Giant would butt heads with so many, and I'm speaking like freaking hell, would butt heads with my father when he was young, because you can't have two giant super heavyweights come in, and here is a 26, 27-year-old kid who's going 100 miles an hour, and Andre's at the latter half of his career, so he's going to grab him by the back of the head and whop him in the head. Yeah. Literally giving him concussions, and it's just they had to be apart.
That was one thing that I've heard as well. And again, something I didn't know about is whether it's true, whether it's not been worded right. But when your dad left the WWF in '88, it was just shortly after a bit of an altercation or something that was happening between him and Andre after a match they had. Did you hear of anything, or do you remember anything about why he left back then?
No. Like no reason in particular. Other than, actually, I don't know.
No, that's why.
Like I never really heard anything like with a particular incident with Andre. I just know that like when they were in the ring together, Andre would literally beat the dog shit out of my father. Like my father never told me that anybody hated him more than Andre. Like he would grab him by the back of the neck, and like that's a big dude amongst normal men, and that's a giant making a giant look normal. Like and he would just bear paw him in the head. But they had a very long working career, because for 2 years you're doing 260, 270 shows in a year. So, you know, didn't get along that well. They worked an awful lot together. So
I think Andre probably, I don't know. Obviously, you can't speak on their behalf or anything, but maybe looked at what your dad could do in the ring and maybe thought, I'm going to show him what I can do, to show that I've still got the edge size wise. But yeah, I mean, I think seeing your dad cartwheel for the first time is something that really stuck with me. It's like, how did a guy that size be that? What was his background, sort of sports wise, before he got into wrestling?
He was an amateur. He was a phenomenal amateur wrestler. High school All-American. He placed in the States back in New Jersey. Amateur wrestling is very touted. It's one of the top 5 in the nation state-wise for the caliber of wrestling, especially for such a small state. So back then, he was wrestling against guys who were future Olympians. He lost to Bruce Baumgartner, who was a U.S. heavyweight Olympian, multi-gold medalist. Like, those were guys that he was wrestling against in high school. And he was a phenomenal football player. There was actually rumors that he was offered tryouts with the Redskins out of high school. He ended up getting expelled his senior year of high school right before the wrestling season. And he was like, there was nobody that was going to touch him on the mat that season. Like, he was going to be – and they only wrestled 20, 25 matches back then. He was going to walk through everybody. Like, there's folklore about him with a broken leg scaring kids so bad on the other team to forfeit. Like, just by stepping on the scale. Like, his life is a movie in and of itself, but he was a phenomenal amateur athlete, and he would have been professional in anything he had done. That's how successful and how athletic he was. Like, so the cartwheels, the walking on your hands, like, that stuff was commonplace. Like, that was, that's a wrestling practice for him. And he was all about that stuff. He could throw a ball 80 miles an hour and he could hit a 500-foot softball. Like, this dude, he was just so unbelievably talented. And he was fishing and hunting and packing lips. And it was just a sight to be seen. Like, it really was just, you'll never see another person like him ever.
He could have had his pick of anything really that he wanted to do then, in a sense. So,
he had, he had a very tough draw. He became, he had felonies, he had difficult situations, and he always somehow, overcame them and came out on top and ended up, where he was. And the guy's, he's a folk legend.
He is.
Around here, he's a legend.
I move nicely onto sort of, my first memories of him. So I started watching wrestling when I was about 7 years old. So I was sort of 91, 92. And I first remember seeing Bam Bam Bigelow. Still one of my favourite matches, really, for nostalgic purposes, was his match at the Royal Rumble 93 against the Big Boss Man. Because it was the first time at that point, I didn't know his past. I didn't know he'd been in the WWF before and that. I just saw him as this big, mean, angry. His attire set him aside as well. It was so bright, so eye-catching. I still love that look he had. But it was the fact that he was coming in and he just took apart this guy who had sort of dominated late 80s, early 90s for me when I was watching it. The Big Boss Man was one of the big men up to that point, and he just came in and sort of rolled him over. And he was so intimidating what he was doing. He's slapping his head and the tattoos and everything. It's like, as a sort of 7-8-year-old kid, he, as I've referenced it in other episodes, he's one of the type of heels who made me fear for my favorites because of what he was doing. Literally, I mean, the way he hit out at people, you really felt every blow, even watching it at home, and that 93 stint for me is what I always tend to go back to. It's one of my favorite eras. But what made him for me is the King of the Ring. I was a massive Bret Hart fan, so I loved the story they were telling, and I don't think there's been, I did a show on the King of the Ring a couple of weeks ago, and I talked about my favorite King of the Ring being that whole event, but for that final, I don't think there's been a match like it. They really told that story, because you feared for Bret, you wanted him to win, and then your dad's in there. It's just picking up the pieces. You know, I mean, that's sort of the image that I had as an 8-year-old. I mean, what was he like? I'll get into the obvious question, I suppose. What was he like away from the ring? You know, what was it like growing up around him? What was he like at home?
There was no wrestling. It was like, what season is it? Is it fishing season? Is it hunting season? Or do you got a baseball game? Do you have did my brother have a wrestling match? Like, it was dad normal, like, let's go, let's make up for the time that I was away. Or, I just spent 2 weeks doing what everybody else wanted me to do. I'm going to spend 2 weeks doing what I want to do. Let's go drive down to Florida and go bass fishing on a lake. Like, I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want, like, he was the thing with, he never got to take the character off. Yeah, no. Like, you tattooed it on your head, dude. Like, we'd go out in public and he'd put up a hoodie, and he'd put a hoodie on, and he would wear these Ray-Bans, and all his friends would make fun of him. They call him the Unibammer, like the Unabomber, because he would just have this thing down, because he would hide his head, because then he just looked like a big dude from New Jersey with tattoos. Like, people, but everybody around here kind of knew him, but he'd have his glasses on. We'd go to the mall. There'd be people. Like, he was like a jungle gym. Kids would be climbing all over him, all over the place. So, like, when he was home, he wanted to relax. He wanted to, he was in a deer stand. He was out on the boat, and most of the time he was sinking the boat while we were on it. But you know what? It was always fun. It was always something outside, and it was just, there was never dull moment, and we were always doing something, and it was making up for the time that was taken. And I cherish that now.
Yeah. I mean, how do you remember what it was like when obviously then he had to go away again? Because, you hear about him being on the road, 300 days a year or whatever it was. What was it like when he was gone, as a family?
I still have a very strong family structure. We have a very strong family structure. My mother is a 20-year teacher. She took care of things in the house. We have a great family. Everybody was involved, and they still live very local. They picked up where he left off, and there wasn't like an absence where things shut down. Like, we made every baseball practice, we made every football practice, we made every single thing, and then some. Like, we were always so active, and it afforded me to get really close to my grandparents, because where my mother would go to college, she went to college, finished school, or she was working, that's where my grandmother, grandfather, my aunts and uncles, and everybody stepped in. So it was a community to raise my brother, sister, and myself, and we turned out all right. I think so.
Oh,
so
yeah.
It's debatable.
Two sides to every story. Okay, so another obvious question, so what are your favorite matches or moments that you got to witness of his career, whether it's you saw it on TV or whether it was one that you saw in person?
Man, I say it every time. I loved everything ECW, every single thing ECW, because I hit that maybe 8 years old to 11 years old. Those 3 years. And, like, you're talking Philadelphia shows every weekend. Like, I loved everything ECW. Like, even so much so to where, like, my favorite moments aren't even moments that involve my father. It was moments backstage hanging out with Chris Candido, or moments backstage hanging out with Jerry the Wall Tootie, who was an ECW guy, ended up being a WCW guy. He's big in Japan. Like, in backstage, like, seeing characters like Balls Mahoney and seeing, like, the Blue Meanie, and, like, just being in the backstage. Like, I remember Yokozuna giving me $100 bill, telling me to go get a Coke for him. And like, not looking at it and then trying to put $100 bill in the machine and not working, and then like pushing the button and the Coke pops out, because in these stadiums all the vending machines are free. So I go to give him a Coke and $100, and he's like, "Nah, brother, keep that." And I'm like,
Wow.
man. And it's just like little things like that, like meeting Bret Hart. Bret Hart was so cool. So like you say that the King of the Ring, that whole series, like I love that. But Bret loved my father because he used to like getting the dog shit kicked out of him. Every match, he felt like Bret Hart was gonna die.
Yeah.
Like you were watching a Bret Hart match, and like I want to say I watched one Bret Hart match, and my father was beating him so badly, and Jerry Lawler is standing on the second tier, and he is in Bret Hart's mother's face, and he's like, "You fat old lady, look at her, look at him dying," and I'm like. I'm watching this now, and I'm like, "Jeez!" Jerry Lawler is just ripping into them. He's like, "He's dead. He's done. He's a bum." And like, sure enough, in true Bret Hart fashion, he does the whole like arm drag, picks up, and then he comes back and does like the whole big thing. But he loved that, and it played so well because like my father didn't give a shit. He just wanted to put on a good show, and would beat the brakes out of Bret, and then just let him have it. Like they work so well. So like I remember that stuff. And you said the big boss man. I remember like the last time I was actually like vested into it to where I didn't realize that like my father, that was my father and it wasn't his career. Like, I thought the characters were. When my father was beating the brakes out of the big boss man, he was throwing up on TV, and I'm like, yeah, kill him. And I was so amped. And like I really wanted like the big boss man to lose, and I was so against him and all this stuff. But like now, that was like the last time I was really like a super fan, because after that I was like, oh, that's my dad. Like, that's him. It was too cool that after that.
It's, when you're growing up as a young fan, I don't know if it's just me, but especially back then, you were expected to cheer the good guys. Having your dad as one of the bad guys, did that change your sort of outlook on it? Did you obviously not care, and you were sort of siding with the heels more, or
it all who I identified with, like like it was all. I liked him as a heel, but when he was a face, like he was with Hulk Hogan, and he was with like all like the big names, and it was like it was just like a brighter, happier time. Like when he was a heel, like I'm almost positive like people on the street would be like, "Your dad sucks." Like, dude, like, you kidding me? Like I'm a 9-year-old kid. They're like, "And you suck too, kid." And I'm like, so I liked him as a face. It was a lot easier on my day to day.
Okay, fair enough. I thought it was, jumping ahead because I wanted to talk about sort of the middle bit, 94. I don't know. I kind of felt the WWF almost didn't seem to know where to put him, because, going off from working with, Undertaker and Bret Hart and that, and then he got into a feud with Doink and Tatanka and that. And then sort of towards the end of 94, they didn't seem to, he sort of seemed to be bouncing around the middle a little bit. I mean, did you ever get anything from him as to what his expectations were in the WWF, or was he kind of just enjoying the ride?
Yeah, he took it as a business, like there at that time, and it's widely talked about that like the Clique had influences throughout the WWF. So from my understanding now is he might have known that there was only so high he was going to go within the company. Like for him to get the co-main event in WrestleMania, like why are you going to co-main? Like there's only one main event, and that's the last thing. That's what everybody came for. But somebody somewhere in production, for their ego, they needed to list it as the co-main event. But like me as a person in just my regular world, if you need to label something like that and devalue it just to fill somebody else's ego, then this is not necessarily the place for me. And maybe that's how he felt at the time. So he took it for what it was, and he had a great time with Lawrence Taylor. He developed a fantastic friendship. They played golf extensively. Like, they were supposed to be, training in like a blacked out ring so that nobody knew about, and they were out golfing. So like he had such a great time and enjoyed it, and I don't think he let it get to him. There's a lot of guys that really let it get to them and really let it affect their careers, and he knew that at the end of the day, because even if you look at some of his interviews, he goes, "I was the highest paid jobber in the world." Like, I got paid to lose, and he didn't really care. Like, you want to fly me out to Japan to go step into a cage with Kimo Leopold, and you're going to give me $75,000, and I don't have to do anything else? I just got to step foot in that cage? Come on, man. Yeah. I'd take that if a boxer gave me that. Like, I'm gonna get robbed in about 30 seconds flat, but cash in hand. Yeah. And he was smart enough to take the money and go where it was successful, and not get caught up in a knockdown drag out to where people are watching a dark side of the ring about his career, because he didn't let it. He separated house and state. When I'm working, I'm working. When I'm off. And if my work interferes with my home, then I'm gonna go find somewhere else. And
it's got to be quite a brave move in that kind of industry, really. Brave in a sense. I mean, somebody has got to be on the losing side in a match and be able to take that and take it on quite a stint. I mean, 95. We'll talk about LT in a minute, but sort of towards the end of 95, as a fan, I thought it's quite shocking, really. You had this guy who a couple of years ago was going through everyone, and all of a sudden he's losing to people like Goldust. I know now he's on his way out, so obviously, putting over the new guys and whatever was probably part of it. But being able to take that and switch off your ego for a second and think, I don't know, supporting my family or whatever, he was thinking at that point, taking the money and being able to rise above professionally what your character was going to be portrayed as, I suppose.
Very, very unselfish. Like, even something, not even hearing from him, I ran into an old wrestler. We called him Paulie B. He wrestled for the ECW. He was a lower card guy, and he told me a story of my father. He goes, your father didn't really get wrapped up in the belts and all this stuff. And he told me a story about the time in ECW where my father dropped a belt to Rob Van Dam.
Yeah.
He said that Paulie, or management at the time, had came up to him and was like, "When are you going to drop the belt? Can you drop the belt to Rob? Can you drop the belt to Rob?" And for a couple matches leading up to, I guess, the pay-per-view or the event that he ended up doing it, he was like, nah. And the one time, the guy Paulie, who was telling me the story that was there, they were in the town that he dropped. He goes, they asked him again, and my father goes, "I'll do it if you give Paulie a job." And they go, "Done." And he dropped the belt to Rob. Right. Now, Van Dam ended up taking that and completely turning it into a Hall of Fame career. I mean, he was all RVD was the shit before then.
Yeah.
But when they did his whole Hall of Fame thing, they kind of put that as the jumping point of his career for everybody to start noticing him. But everybody that knows ECW knows RVD was the shit before then. But once he got that, I think it was the international title or something like that. That's how the WWE kind of saw it, as like, this guy is just springboarding, and he just did not lose after that.
Yeah.
But that goes back, like, something as simple as like having a belt and holding on to it, and then just being like, all right, well, give my buddy a job and you could have it. Like, that don't affect my bottom line. What we agreed upon, my contract is fine. Like, me holding this, he probably was like, "Listen, I don't want to have the burden of potentially losing this freaking thing in the airport. So take it, because they're heavy." Yeah. And they got to bring them with them. Like, "Congratulations, pass the torch to you. You got to carry this 25-pound leather thing now in your bag that's completely full." So, like, it's just, I'm sure he was just like, "Get this thing away from me."
That's when I was growing up, I always thought, actually, yeah, was it the actual belt? Did they get to take him home? Did they just have to hand it over to the office at the end of the show and they give it back to him at the next one? And did you kind of, grow up with him with these belts around the house?
Yeah. So they took him home. Yeah, they always took him home, which was really cool. And like, at least when I was a kid, because I'm looking at a picture on my fridge right now of my grandfather, my late grandfather, standing on my porch of my house with Yokozuna's world championship belt like this around his waist. So like, it's just like, and then there's one with him with the Intercontinental belt. Like, we had ECW, but like there's pictures of like my brother and sister like standing on the bed with like my mother holding the ECW like Extreme Hardcore Championship belt on around my brother's waist. Like just stuff like that was so cool. That like, like dad won the strap, like he's coming home with it. Like you knew it was cool. Like winning the Stanley Cup, you're gonna bring it around. But yeah,
there I was making them out of cardboard boxes and that back then, and thinking I was cool. So wow.
That kid's the coolest kid around town. That kid that's got the bandana real tight, that's got his homemade cardboard. Yeah. Not fucking with that kid.
Unfortunately, it wasn't like that round for me, but there we go. Never mind. But so kind of let's stick around the ECW for just a second. I'm bouncing all around the place here, but it's just stuff that's coming to me. Because as a fan, I wasn't overly familiar and probably still not massively familiar with his time in ECW as I am with WCW and WWF. Mainly because over in the UK, we didn't really get ECW on TV. So I've heard snippets. I've seen obviously legendary bits about him going through the ring with Taz, I think, and stuff like that. Just sort of talk us through some of the more memorable moments or matches he had that you sort of still hold dear from that time. I know you said you like that whole part of his career, but is there anything in particular?
I remember, and this is not even a match, right? I remember getting knocked out by a guy at an ECW match. This is how awesome ECW was. Like punching 10-year-olds in the face. There's no holds barred. No holds barred. So we would go to these ECW matches, and they were at various hockey rinks, which was also another awesome thing. They were at various hockey rinks throughout the tri-state area. And it would always be but it would be like a hockey rink, and then there'd just be like 1,000 chairs all around. So my father would just be like, all right, well, here's the backstage. These are the two guys, and you can go walk around the concessions and go watch the matches. So I'm like walking around the outskirts, and it's like Sabu and somebody else. It might be like Sabu and Sandman go like over the guardrail, and they're just beating the shit out of each other. And they're now in the stands, just like kendo sticking each other in the face, just like pow, 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 back and forth. And of course, ECW had more fights in the stands than had in the actual matches. Yeah. So like everybody just swarms right around them. This dude who is just completely boofy blitzed and is just like sees me. And I'm not a small kid, but I might be like 10 years old at the time. And just like doesn't just go to like face palm me, he's just like backhand smacks me in the head. I'm like, whoa. Oh no. And the type of like, I've never been punched by a grown man. I'm a 10-year-old, never been punched, and where you get hit and you lose your breath, where you're like, so sure enough, I'm like bawling. I don't know what the hell's going on. Never been punched by. And I go backstage, and my dad looks at me, and he's like sitting, and he's got this big old lip, and he's like, what happened? And I'm like, I don't know, man. This guy with a T-shirt, a Booker T T-shirt, just punched me right in the head. I don't know what the hell. It just said with a Harlem Heat T, and he's just like, find him. I'm like, what? He's like, find him. And like the show almost shut down. Like a couple matches go in, and this is how I knew how serious it was. Chris Candido, who was wildly successful, has been in the career forever, was scared to death. We find this guy, brought him in the back, and he, like little children, my father said to Candido, he goes, you're going to watch him. And like they went behind this curtain, and all you just keep hearing is just these like loud smacks. He's like, you want to hit a kid? Boom. And Chris and Candido was sitting there, and he's he's like, "Oh, big man, how you doing? You all right?" You know, he had this real high pitched voice, like the Body Donnas. He had this real high pitched voice, and my father came out and sat back down. He's like, "That ever happens again, you come right back." And like, okay, this dude. So the police come in. This guy is so drunk, he's spitting on the police. He tries fighting the cops anyway. And I just remember like watching in the background. My father just got up and went back to his seat and tied his boots and went out to the match. And like the whole backstage was just like,
wow.
So that's what I remember. That's what I remember. And like those guys are the nicest guys. Like they were they were like uncles and like growing it's Jimmy Superfly Snuka and like, you know, King Kong Bundy. And like when my father's matches were going on, those are the guys that are sitting and watching you. Like, that's cool, man.
That's very cool. Yeah. I mean, what other place can you go and, you know, you get these, you know, parent take your kid to work days kind of thing. I don't know if they do them so much anymore, but I don't think many people have got those kind of stories from those, to be fair. It's pretty cool.
No, and like show and tell day, like bring your parents to school day, like, you know, it was a little shocking. The teacher's like,
Did you do that?
Yeah,
that's cool.
Of course, my brother did it. My sister did it. I dressed up one year somewhere. My mother probably has it as blackmail. I dressed up in his Triple B outfit and wore it for Halloween.
Awesome.
And like showed up to school and like put like a skull cap on, like drew the flames on it. Like that. We had fun with it. It was
brilliant.
Cool.
That is brilliant. Oh, well done. So let's go back in time. I said I was going to circle back to this because one of the biggest, I suppose, most famous moments in his career or times in his career was the Lawrence Taylor kind of a few months they were building towards that in the match at WrestleMania. I know a lot, you know, in the grand scheme of things, in terms of, like I was saying, his character in WWF, a lot of people say this is when it kind of took a turn because they allowed LT to beat him, like you say, in the main event of WrestleMania. But you know, I understand you were at the event. You got to be around. Obviously, you would have got to be around them probably outside the ring as well. But what was the whole feeling around that time between your dad and LT, and sort of, you know, your memories of the build up to that night?
Like I said, they were supposed to be training and they were out on the golf course. I was out. I played this morning and I'm looking at the club and I'm like, I'm pretty sure LT left half of these clubs to my father. You know, like that's LT lived in the tri-state area, lived in New York. He had friends up and down. They shared a lot of mutual friends because when he was playing for the Giants from 85 to 95, whichever, that's when the peak of WWF had gone on. So you're talking about athletes that were all in their prime in their respective fields. So they lived it up. I mean, it's Lawrence Taylor. Like you're not going to hang out with Lawrence Taylor. But they had a good time. And for them to say that they let LT beat him, that was the plan all along. Like you can't just hype this all up and then just have one of your superstars beat this guy. Then you can never do it again.
No.
You can never bring, like, if every time Shaquille O'Neal shows up to the WCW, they beat him, they're going to be like, well, why are we going to bring this dude back? Well, obviously Lawrence Taylor, and like through God's will, he got him through that match to beat him.
And that's the thing. Whenever, you know, people trash that match, I know the whole year, again, I've done an episode on how bad 95 was, even though I've got my own fond memories of it. You know, they sort of say it was one of those low moments, Nat, but that a non-wrestler could beat a wrestler like him. But how good did your dad make him look? You know, he had to do that. You know, for LT to look impressive, your dad had to lead most of that.
It's one of those things, and it's just like one of those things widely respected. Like for you to take someone that is not in your field, even remotely in your field, and get him up to speed and make it look like he's done this his entire life, whether you want to criticize it or whatever, for someone, and I believe it was Kevin Nash. I met when I was in college, my friends and I, when he was in TNA or involved around TNA, we went out and we met these guys at a bar, and he almost elbowed my buddy in the head. But Kevin Nash, he said, we knew that your father could carry him, and in the wrestling world, they knew that his abilities were capable enough that you could put anybody out there and he'd make them look good. And you know, that's a testament and a respect within the industry. And that's the only thing I've ever really heard in regards from people who knew that match on a personal level. Like, obviously fans will criticize it for what it is because, you know, it's not the showmanship, but it's one of the first time a superstar like that that crosses over into the WWF, WWE world. You know, one of the first times where they've segued superstars into a main event and been able to yield fans. That was the litmus test for all these guys, you know. So the person, and it's a weighted selection. Like, the person that they chose to carry that match is somebody that they have the utmost confidence in. That could have completely made or break that whole company.
Yeah. It's a bit of a risk, a calculated risk, I suppose. But you know, yeah. I like to think as much as WrestleMania 11 is not high on people's list as their favorites of WrestleMania history, I got a soft spot for it. You know, it was. Yeah, I thought the last two matches really pulled up the rest of the show.
It's just, you know why? It's because it's in the peak, and that we went going back to what I said about co-main events before. Because if you taken the two matches and you flipped, then you made my father's match the second to last match, and you labeled that as a co-main event, and you finished that with the match that it was, we're having a very different conversation about how that WrestleMania goes down. You know, like you're talking about the order of events, because everybody says the co-main event, but they're tying it to the last match. If you switch the order of those two, WrestleMania 11 very well could be. I mean, you have Salt and Pepper out there singing "Shoot" at the height of Salt and Pepper in Hartford, Connecticut. I mean, I don't know about Hartford, Connecticut now, but it was pretty sweet back then. So that could have been the greatest WrestleMania of them all. No. I like the color scheme, the purple black. It was cool.
Yeah. I mean, out of his outfits, that's one of my favorite sort of color combinations. I think the one that really will sit with me though is the first one I saw again for the Royal Rumble, where it's very much the yellow on the black. I don't know. He had one of the coolest looks, I think, with the tattoos and everything as well. Very eye-catching.
I see a lot of guys now that try to like emulate and replicate the look, and like it just doesn't. And I'm extremely biased, so I'm allowed to be. But it falls short. It doesn't like. I very rarely do you see a guy that's in a full bodysuit that it's not like a Kane gimmick or a Goldust gimmick or my father but like, even if you see these guys in the indies that are trying to pull off a full bodysuit that's part of their character, it doesn't strike home as it doesn't hit as well for some reason. It just was, every suit he came out with, like I the purple one, I like the gray one, the yellow and red one. He even had one in Japan that was like a tank top where you'd only really see him with Vader, and it had flames up the shoulders, but it looked like a bro tank. And like, you got the pictures of like them two flexing. Like, there are so many cool iterations of his suit, and like little funny things that were built into his suit. Like there were these two little flame balls on his nuts on I think the purple suit. Like, and you know, like something that people wouldn't see, but like your crotch is on fire. Like, and he'd be like
they'll be looking for it now. So weird as that is, but
it's weird. And you just go like, I've read forums where people were like, "Oh, I bet those stack." And my mom could attest to it, but she watched them. So for all you haters on the internet, they were washed. I don't know about in between, but they were washed.
There you go.
That's certain.
Just to set the record straight, where did the whole the fire and the flames look come from for him? Do you know?
So, like I said, my father is a legend before the whole Bam Bam Bigelow character, and him having the around here, the town Asbury Park has a big following with like Bruce Springsteen and like music community in the late 70s, early 80s. And then that whole community had like, there was bikers, there was musicians, there was tattoo artists. My father was very much involved in all of every bit of that. And he had gotten through probably being extremely drunk in one way or another. He had tattoos on the side of his head. He had like shooting stars and like flames. It was like a flaming ball on the side of his head. So if you look at either the left or right side of his head, it's like a black mass of tattoos. That's actually a cover up of the original tattoo.
Okay.
So he had flames on the side of his head. He ended up being a bouncer / bounty hunter and went on this absurd mission to Mexico to go find this girl who was kidnapped by her boyfriend, and he had to go find him, and the guy that was with him got killed and shot in the throat, and he ended up spending 6 months in a Mexican jail, and he would run through walls, and then he would have to protect the judge. So like, and the judge granted him clemency. There was this whole absurd. There's a video on YouTube of him explaining, I'm pretty sure explaining in detail of this story, but he spent like 6 months in a Mexican jail, granted him clemency. He came back home, spent 6 months in a regular jail here, and then like he started joining the Monster. He joined the Monster Factory as a means to sleep in a hangar for a place to stay, and he was really just moving their rings at first.
Right.
And so he would set the rings up for them, and they would be like, well, Scotty, can you work this guy out? We know you're an amateur wrestler. And he moved above and beyond. I mean, the tale is in the story. There's a video on YouTube where he's maybe like 22 years old, and he's in a tattoo chair, and he's getting his head tattooed by Gene Bernardo, and they're interviewing him, and he's got no gloves on, and it's like completely unsterile, and you're like cringing, but he's tattooing his head. And my father, really young, he's saying this. He's like, people love to hate, man. He goes, if I could just find that hatred in these people, I can make money. And that goes back to what we said before, is like, he was a heel, and he made money off losing, but he made money off of hatred. And that's the wrestling business. People love to hate. This is the wrestling, and that's what's amazing about it, is one of the only sports that you'll watch because you hate somebody.
Yeah.
I'm gonna watch this to see you get your ass beat. Like, I listen, I love football, but I'm not watching no team that I don't like. It's not in the cards, but I might turn it on to watch Goldberg Street get beaten. I'm gonna turn it on to watch. So like, the people love to hate. So and it's just.
I've never thought about it like that before, actually. But obviously that's what sets wrestling aside. You've got equal amounts to love and hate in there. I think it's why I can sit through a 3-hour show and always, want to watch what's coming up. So.
And people are so vested in it. Like, like I said, I walking down the street, people cursing me out, telling me my father sucks. Like, and this is 8 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday. Like, but you care enough about someone that you don't like, that you watched on TV, that in the back of your head, it's just a show. But like, people's grandparents, like grandmothers, being like, I don't like him. Like, that's what wrestling's all about, man. I love that about it.
And that goes right back to, sort of 50s, 60s, 70s when it first was becoming popular, I think, because, you had the same back then. You had the really over-the-top heels that people wanted to see get their ass kicked. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was an actual, like, it was touted as a boxing match. Like, it was a professional amateur wrestling match. Like, those guys had half-hour, 45-minute long matches until they submitted somebody. Like, has early roots in grappling and MMA because the professional Gorgeous Georges and all those guys from eons ago, they actually had to submit the guy that they were going against and put on a show at the same time. Like Babe Ruth dabbled with professional wrestling, like he did amateur wrestling, but like just crazy stuff like that.
Didn't know that. It's one aspect of your dad's career that I was just sort of mulling over earlier, actually, is that he had a range of managers through much of his sort of early career. It wasn't until sort of later on that I remember he didn't really need someone out there in the ring with him. But he had a range, whether it was going back Oliver Humperdinck, you had Luna Vachon, you had Ted DiBiase. Did you have a favorite sort of manager that you think suited him best, or even did he have a favorite as well that you knew of?
He loved Oliver Humperdinck. Oliver Humperdinck, he was such a nice man. Like I got to know Oliver personally towards the end of his life. Humperdinck was funny. He used Facebook like an old man. So like he would message you and he'd be like, Oliver Humperdinck says hello, Shane Bigelow. And I'd be like, Hump, like, you know, like I'm like, Dink, what's up, dude? Like I seem like a normal. And he'd be like, oh, I love it. Like my mother loved Oliver, my father loved it, because back then when you had a young talent like that, they would put them with these veteran, you know, like Paul Bearer with Undertaker. And they would put them with these veteran managers to speak for them and foster them. So like Humperdinck was like the guy that trained him. Even like Larry's the Monster Factory, they helped him and they did all that, but like Humperdinck guided him in shark-infested waters. Like, you know, he told them the rights and wrongs, the ins and outs. So I feel like my father will always forever be grateful to Humperdinck. Luna Vachon, that was more of just a gimmick. You know, they had, because at that time it was Doink and Dink with Luna Vachon and my father. And what's funny is the second Dink, which is Ray Apollo, the second Doink, which is Ray Apollo, is my brother's godfather. And he lives 45 minutes north of me. So like he was over our house and we were very close prior to that. Yeah. And when they were going through that whole gimmick, it was like Uncle Ray and Dad are going on a trip. And then it was like, it was funny because people think Luna Vachon is my mother. And I'm like, you're really insulting my mother. But it was like funny, you know, and then like we'd have Dink and he'd be over the house and I have like, we've always had giant dogs. I had a Great Dane. His name was Caesar. Right. And this is on the internet where they say that my father used to torture Dink. Well, Dink did it to himself. Right? And I can attest to that because I was there. So like a little person walks into a house with a dog that can literally eat food out of the kitchen sink. This dog would walk up to the kitchen sink and drink from whatever bowl was in it. This was Caesar. So, you know, Dink, Caesar, and come over to my house, barbecue. We always had that. He was always welcome. They were always, you know, they were friends. They were always laughing. They were always drinking. They were always having a good time. But, you know, sometimes they were ball breakers. And you got this big Great Dane, and sure enough, Dink comes walking in, and they don't tell him about Caesar. And Caesar's like gets in your face. He's big licky, and he's got poor Dink pinned up in the corner, and it's just licking his face. And Dink's French Canadian, so if you've ever heard like a French Canadian guy like freaking out, it's kind of funny. He's like, wow, get the dog for me. So like, and you're not gonna laugh. Like it's hilarious. So eventually you get Caesar off, but I guess having been, you know, razzed his whole life, he didn't take it too great. No. That time he did. Other times he didn't. But I just remember that era, you know, and getting back to the managers, like Luna Vachon, it was more of a gimmick. You know, Humperdinck was really his one true manager. Ted DiBiase, that was more of just $1 million corporation where they were just angling that to set up, because that led into the WrestleMania 11, right? He was part of the $1 million corporation. So That was more just
Yeah.
gimmicks all around.
I'd say at the time, that's interesting to hear that side of it, really, because obviously Luna was the first one that I knew with him, as I went back and learned more about his career before I saw him with Humperdinck. And I mean, as an image, exactly, as a sort of the gimmick, they fit perfectly, because you've almost got the male and female version of each other, sort of, wreaking havoc. So that's quite cool.
What's funny is like Luna, she was great. Like she had a report, she'd be over my house. I remember my father taking her because you know how she had the veins in the side of her head?
Yeah.
The first few years of her career, she would draw those on with stencil or whatever, eyeliner makeup. And I remember my father specifically taking her to my cousin to go get those tattooed on the side of her head.
Wow.
Like that was like, they were close friends, and outside of that, and she was welcome at our house to the point where she was getting her head tattooed at my house. Like that's brilliant. They were colleagues, because Luna Vachon was not a manager. She was a wrestler. And really part of that gimmick was what's funny is they said the stipulation was my father cannot touch Dink in the ring. So if you go back and watch those matches, they would always mess around and they would play around, because my father would get in the ring and you'd see Dink like start bugging out, because he'd be like, "You're not supposed to be doing this. Like you're supposed to be out. I'm supposed to wrestle Luna." Yeah. And he'd always like check him and be like, "I'm coming for you." And then like, nah. But Luna would get in and she would go just balls to the wall.
Yeah.
And it's funny to watch, because having known that like backstage dynamic between the four of them, like you could see a lot of like Doink in the corner, like with his head in his arm, laughing his ass off because of Luna and Doink. Like they're laughing and talking shit and the whole match. Right. Like that's probably the most fun two grown men can have without anybody knowing it. Like they were dying the whole time.
That's brilliant, because again, that's another sort of part of his WWF run, which I think almost turned a bit comical, was that run with Doink and the match they had at WrestleMania. Entertaining as hell as it was. I might watch that again with fresh eyes now. So
you definitely, like, if you go back and you see like some of their gimmicks, and like, because Matt Bourne was a great Doink the Clown, and he was dark, he was twisted, he was nasty and like sinister. Like you can obviously compare the two, but like Matt Bourne's was like evil, and if you're gonna have somebody try to refill that, and like Ray Apollo, that's how he is outside of character, so like it's funny because you would see them like lock eyes and he'd squirt them. It's like, my father's like, "You motherfucker." like because that's how they were best friends outside of the ring. They were fishing 24/7. So like when I talked about every time he would travel to Japan, the person sitting in the seat next to him 9 times out of 10 was Doink the Clown, right? Like that's what it was like with them at that time, and it was so cool. And even to the point where his children, Tony Ann and Tiana, are extremely close with my brother, sister, and myself. Like they would go away, and like the wives and children's would have like, we'd have like, we go to the mall. Like it was cool. It was cool. It was really, really cool.
And this really is sort of delving behind the curtain sort of thing, because you're great. You are made to believe at that point, more so in that era, because without social media and kayfabe still being around, you really do think that these guys hate each other. That's how you were conditioned. So learning that was literally just on for the cameras, and they were best friends behind it. It's great. That's really cool.
It was great because Doink, he had the makeup, so when he took it off, he had an anonymity to an extent. Like they knew that he was a wrestler because he was wearing Zubas and a fanny pack. Like, and he was,
everyone did,
absolutely yoked. But like, coming out of the locker room, that's Hulk Hogan. That's Bam Bam Bigelow. Like, he had a little bit of leeway to where people would hound my father and he'd be able to like ball break. They'd be like, so who are you? He'd be like, I'm Chief J Strongbow. Like, and he was a ball breaker like that. And he could just do and say, he was able to kind of like dip in and out. So they could travel together. They could be, kayfabe was a little less lax because nobody knew who he was, and he was able to control who he was. And it was really cool. And they had a lot of fun with it. Like, they have their own language, which is funny. Like, they were able to talk in the front of people, like completely talk in front of people and just be like, look at this jabroni. Like, this guy is an absolute scrub. Like, let's sign it and get out of here and go get a six-pack. And this guy would be like, yeah, and they would just be smiling and they'd be talking to each other. They'd be like, yeah. And they have a full conversation insulting you right to your face, but you didn't know it. You were just like, oh man, these guys are so nice. They were like insulting them, but they were just, they had a language that they could speak behind closed doors that it was a sight to be seen for sure.
That's cool. That's really cool. So sort of winding up to, we'll go back to the sort of tail end of his career. So looking at ECW and then briefly going back to WCW. Did he kind of have, I don't know, have more fun in that later part? Was it more that he had a little bit more leeway, a little bit more, he was a bit more comfortable then with, trying new things or not having so much pressure on him as in the WWF?
I think looking back at it, he was in his like veteran, I've been there. I'm going to do it how I want to do it. And like, you see it in his character, like in the WCW, his outfit slacks a little bit. He starts wearing the t-shirt and the pants and a few things. Like he has a little bit more freedoms with his character and the storyline. Like he loved Bill Goldberg. Goldberg loved him. Like he loved that line. But that part of his career was bittersweet because he was in a lot of pain, and he had bone spurs up and down entire cervical vertebrae, every bit of his spine. He had stenosis. He had microfractures up and down. Like it was astonishing just to see the fact that he could walk. Like the doctor, he had spine surgery maybe like 3 or 4 years before he passed away. And the doctor was like, I've seen this back on a man who worked in like quarries every day in their life. Like, so in the WCW, 2001, 98 to 2001, it was a good time because he's making a lot of money. He had consistent salary checks, whether they were working or not. When AOL bought them out, he knew that he was going to get X amount of dollars for X amount of time. And he had that comfort, but that was the time where, slowing down, everything catches up with you. I mean, he'd had multiple knee surgeries, elbow surgeries leading up to that, but that was, maintenance. Now it's, now you're talking about structural, like it's taking you a half hour to get out of bed. It's taking you an hour to get out of bed. And then you start to have people now that you're in your career at WCW, they're on TNT every night. You get doctors who have no business in prescribing what they prescribe, being like, hey man, let me get, 2 or 3 autographs. And then like in the same way you and I would go tip a bartender and be like, yo, here's a script for refills on oxys. Like if I got to take 2 or 3 of those to get out of bed in the morning and you're going to tell me I don't got to jump through hoops and you're just going to give me one of these piece of papers to sign, not 10 out of 10 of those guys are taking those because there's no health care. There's no benefits package to where, if I'm in the NFL and I break my leg, you're going to pay for my doctor. Now I got to make sure if I'm not working, I'm not getting paid. And the WCW is very bittersweet because that's after doing 5 years of hardcore matches in ECW. And now WCW wants to literally absorb the hardcore title because that was his thing. Now you got to do it, every Thursday night as opposed to picking and choosing when you wanted to do it.
Right.
So you really saw the deterioration of just his physical body, like being able to move. Like you would never know. And I could watch matches and I could see the pain that he's going through towards the end. But like anybody outside of the business, you wouldn't know that he couldn't get out of the chair.
No.
Or he couldn't get out of bed for 3 hours in the morning just because he had to do 5 shows in a row.
Yeah. And he was still doing the same kind of stuff that he'd done for years. He was just kind of saving it all up for that.
All gas, no brakes, man. Like you couldn't slow it because in the same way, going back to what we talked about before, where Andre kind of felt threatened by new talent. Like there's these new guys that are coming in that, I don't know anything to you. I'm an independent contractor. And if you're slipping, I'm going to put you on blast in front of everybody. And there's nothing you could do behind the scenes to gain that back. So you better go out there and put your best show on. And that's what you have to do. And some of these guys are able to walk away early enough to live lives after, and others, they're never able to recover, in my father's case.
So that probably answers the next question I had. Sort of, he was there, I think, or thereabouts in WCW when WCW folded and WWE came in. I mean, was there any discussion about him going back to WWE, or would he even wanted to at that point?
The only thing that I know is that because it wasn't the WWE that bought the WCW when it really folded, it was AOL Time Warner that bought the WCW. And at that time, AOL, everybody had AIM, that was the thing. You still had to buy dial-up internet and all that crap. So AOL bought it, and what they had done, they said that they would give people a cash, like a 75 cents to the dollar buyout on the remainder of their contract, or you can effectively ride your contract out and make the full maturity of it. But after that, you're figure it out on your own. So, that's 2000 that it gets sold, and it doesn't fully absolve, or my father's contract doesn't fully absolve till 2001. So he took kind of like an early retirement for a year and a half to where he was making almost $300,000 to $500,000 a year that 1 year just to finish his contract out. Right? Nice. If he had wanted to go to the WWF, he could have taken, so for instance, say he had a $100,000 contract, they would have gave him $75,000, and he could have went and signed with anybody the following day. He chose, because he knew his back and all the injuries were catching up to him, chose to ride his contract out because he had about a year and a half on it and kind of get healthy in that time being. But in that time, spinal stenosis had gotten worse. Back surgeries were not what they are today. No. By no means. This is 2000, 2001. So they were talking about completely fusing his whole back. If this happened in 2015, he'd have a 1-inch incision in his lower back, and he'd probably be on the golf course right now. Yeah. But, you make an 8-inch cut in his back, and it's just little by little. He didn't want to fuse his entire spine because he didn't want to be in a mobility scooter. No. So they do little surgeries here to try to get him some pressure to alleviate the swelling of the stenosis. And in that year and a half, it just maturated that my body's done. And he did a couple shows here and there, he did a couple local shows, but it just he had this one back surgery and it just couldn't recover from it. He was able to walk, but it was near debilitating. Yeah. He would have been paralyzed had he continued, without a doubt.
Wow. So I don't want to dwell on, the end of his life too much in that, but sort of what were the things he was enjoying sort of at the end when he stepped away from the ring and, towards the end?
A lot of fishing, a lot of weed, and no responsibility,
sounds good.
Everybody, and recently everybody's been trying to hit me up for some dark side of the ring type of tale, to be to like sell my family down the river to make it sound like I had this horrible end. Listen, my parents got divorced. My father moved to Pennsylvania, then he moved to Florida. He did what he wanted when he wanted, you know, having taken Oxycontins to just get up in the morning deteriorated his heart. Now, if you want to label that as he was a rampant dark side of the ring, freaking abusive, then by all means, but that's what everybody wants to buy nowadays.
Yeah.
And I don't have that. Yeah, I know for a fact he walked around with a gun on his hip, a cigar in his mouth. It was probably a blunt, and he did what he wanted when he wanted, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
So he enjoyed for the short amount of time, he definitely enjoyed the retirement. He took the character with him, and everybody remembered him. Everywhere he went, even when I was a kid, I remember going to the mall and there being a mass of people and me being just kind of tailing behind and being behind a crowd of people and accepting that. And it really is a humbling thing to take a perspective and like see somebody else achieve, like see somebody else in their prime like that. And, that he had that up until the absolute last day of his life. I know.
That's brilliant. That's good. That's good. And so knowing the sort of legacy he's left behind, did you ever get inspired to get in the ring yourself at all? Or did you sort of meddle with it at all?
No. My father, and now that I'm older and I'm understanding like the thing, how your dad leaves for work and he says, remember what I said and listen to your mother. Like, it's true because, the things that he said, you want to do something hard, go to college. And I went to college. My brother went to college. My sister went to college. And the whole time while I was in college, my mother told people that I got a degree in tapping kegs. And the whole time I was in college, I was like, when is this supposed to get hard, Dad? When is this supposed to get hard? But I understand now that having accomplished that nobody can take an education from me and nobody can do that. And at the end of the day, I will always have devices to accomplish something that my father didn't have, an education. And that's what he wanted. He got expelled when he was a senior in high school for throwing a filing cabinet at his teacher. True story. And then he spent the rest of his life, traveling to these universities. His favorite university was Texas A&M. He loved going there, and wrestling in their arena, but he would travel to these giant universities and he got a taste to see like all these college campuses because they would drive everywhere. And he's like, you want to do something hard, you go to college. And then after that, you want to get in that ring, we'll straighten your ass right out. Like he would have most certainly supported any one of us had we wanted to go that route. But he passed away when I was 18. I was a freshman in college. So I didn't have that maturation to where I could have, gotten out and been like, hey, Dad, can you break me in? Now, when I got out of college, I worked at a bar around here. I was one of the bouncers there for a number of years. One of the head of securities there was Bubba Ray Dudley when he was young. This is how crazy, like, when I tell you I live a movie life, Bubba Ray Dudley was the head bouncer at the bar that I was the head bouncer at 15 years after. Right. So when I graduated college and I was working in the bar the summer after my father passed away, and those guys got me through it. Those are the people that really helped me be a man after that. And he was one of the characters that was there. And he even said, like, at the time, he was like, so you want to break in? You want to break in? And I was young. I didn't understand what I was going through at the time, but I knew that I had to finish college. Mm. So I kept giving him the college thing, And respectfully, he was like, you want it? It's here, and I love him to death for it because I had it. Mm. It was accessible. It was there. The offer was there, but I needed to go through college. I needed to
Yeah.
finish that because I needed to forge my own path. I needed to find my own identity. Had I said yes, in 2007, 2008, that's when Bubba Ray was at the height of his WWE career. Like, there's no doubt in my mind that this day sitting here, we'd be having a very different conversation. We'd be talking about my career being parallel to my father's, but I don't know if the man I am would be the same. I was a dumb kid, and it would have been very brash. It would have been very stupid. I would have been very in your face. I had to go through the shit to kind of grow up as a man. And I'm comfortable knowing that I had that opportunity. Like a lot of guys are sitting around like, oh man, I could have been in WWF. I could have done this. Nah, dude, it was there. All I had to do was say yes. But the commitment, I wasn't mature enough at the time.
Okay.
And I'm good with where I'm at. I'm good with teaching. I wanted to be a coach, that was something I really got into because my father had us in the basement, coaching us for amateur wrestling and my brother for amateur wrestling. And then I would end up taking my brother to tournaments throughout up and down the East Coast. We would go because he was a national caliber high school wrestler. And those lessons that he imparted into us, I was like, I'm good at this. So might as well. I love football. I went to college, played football. My brother went to college and wrestled, so being a teacher was cool. And I want summers off. So I champion all you guys. I wish you nothing but the best, man. But it wasn't for me. I rest my head at the end of the day, and I'm okay with that it wasn't for me.
Cool. So just finishing on a little bit of a philosophical question, I suppose. Might be getting a bit deep, but sort of thinking of obviously the memories and the life your dad had. From his life, what sort of lessons would you take from that you pass on to the youngsters you're working with?
Most of the stuff he told me I can't say in school. You want to wax philosophical, I can't be like, listen, kid, don't half-ass this shit. But it really, at the end of the day, it came down to just core values of having integrity and doing something that you're proud of and putting the work into it and not half-assing it. I can always, I hear it as clear as day. It's like you half-assed the taking the garbage out, and now you got to go do it again. So it just put your whole ass into things and you'll be all right.
Okay. That's brilliant. Listen, Shane, this has been amazing, mate. I had so many memories of your dad growing up, and I know nobody's memories could compare to the ones that you guys had growing up with him. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing as much as you have. This has truly been an honor, mate, having you on.
Appreciate it. Thank you for having me. Anytime, I'm always down. Talk some wrestling.
Hey, we can do that. We can do that. Anyway, Shane Bigelow, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Good night. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, share, and hit the subscribe button. Also follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Once Upon a Turnbuckle to keep updated about all future shows.